Some PhDs are useless. This is a thing that some people say fairly often, and it's a very interesting thought, so let's talk about it for a few moments. Now, in order to attempt to answer the question, are some PhDs useless, we first have to understand what a PhD is. A PhD is a Doctor of Philosophy. PhD stands for Doctor of Philosophy. So regardless of your discipline, if you get a PhD, and if it's referred to as a PhD, then you are a Doctor of Philosophy in your discipline. So if you get one in English, you are a Doctor of Philosophy in English. If you get one in biology, you are a Doctor of Philosophy in biology. And if you get one in philosophy, you are a Doctor of Philosophy in philosophy. So a PhD in principle seems to have something to do with philosophy. So in order to understand what a PhD is, it is somewhat useful to understand what philosophy might be. And immediately we run into some hot water here because attempting to define philosophy is a really annoying thing to do, but we will try. Here is one definition of philosophy that I particularly like and I find myself returning to, and we find it in a footnote of the introduction of the groundwork of Metaphysics of Morals by Immanuel Kant. Because this is a footnote, not much time is spent on this definition, so I have to fill in a bunch of the gaps here, but hopefully it makes sense and I do the definition justice. The idea here is that philosophy as a discipline is about taking the presuppositions of other disciplines and making them into fields of study on their own. Here's an example that might help us understand what this means. Imagine with me for a second that you are a teenager and you are at the age where you are about to start applying to universities and you want to become a doctor. You want to become a doctor because you would like to be the first person to cure the common cold, and so you determine in your heart that you are going to go to university to study biology, then you're going to go to med school, then you're going to become the first person to cure the common cold. This is your hope in life. Now, this train of thought is perfectly reasonable. This train of thought makes a lot of sense, but as you may have noticed, there are a lot of unspoken presuppositions in that train of thought. For example, there are a number of moral presuppositions here. For instance, when you say that you want to cure the common cold, it seems as though you are suggesting that you think it would be a good thing if that happened. And so we can ask the question, why do you think it would be good to cure the common cold? And you might say, well, if I cure the common cold, I'm going to reduce the amount of suffering in the world. And I can ask, well, why do you think it's a good thing to reduce the amount of suffering in the world? And even if you don't care about reducing the amount of suffering in the world and what you really want is the money and fame that come from curing the common cold, that's also kind of a moral claim to make. I could ask the question, why do you value money so much? Why do you think fame would be a good thing to have? What does it mean for something to be good? There are also a lot of epistemological considerations here. You are assuming for some reason that if you go to school, you will actually learn things enough to become a doctor. You are assuming that knowledge is something that can be given to you by learning. You are assuming to some extent that what you might get from school will be knowledge and not mere opinion or not mere unjustified beliefs. You are assuming in a very unspoken sense that when your teachers teach you things, they teach you things that are true, and you are assuming a type of definition of truth in this entire train of thought that is not spoken of at all. And so within this simple train of thought of wanting to become a doctor, there are many moral and epistemological issues at play, but you do not have time to engage with every single one of them on the road to becoming a doctor. Now, I've never been to med school, but I'm pretty sure that in your first year in med school, you don't spend the entire time asking questions about the fundamental nature of knowledge. And you spend all the time asking, well, what is knowledge? How do you know when you have knowledge as opposed to opinion? What does it mean to have a justified true belief? Where does knowledge come from? What does it mean to learn something? I don't think that it makes sense for you to spend the first year on those questions and then you can start talking about medical stuff afterwards. But even though they are necessary for you as a doctor to keep at the back of your mind, they are not necessarily necessary for you to bring to the front of your mind as you exist in the world as a doctor. But these questions still need to be dealt with. Somebody needs to be thinking about them, and that is where ideally philosophers come in. The idea here in a somewhat simplified sense is that there are some questions, there are some considerations that you don't necessarily need to spend a whole lot of time with in your day-to-day in whatever discipline that you practice. Some of these questions or considerations might be considered useless to you during your day-to-day, but they are quite foundational to the way your discipline functions. And so if you are a doctor and a person comes into your hospital with an arrow in their foot, you could spend the next 3 hours having a philosophical discussion about the ethics of helping out strangers, but it probably makes more sense for you as a doctor to just try to save that person's foot, but that doesn't mean that that 3-hour discussion is useless. Somebody needs to have it. And you as a doctor can partake in that conversation, but you don't need to devote yourself to it while you are on the clock as a doctor. Your role is to save lives. Philosophy in this definition takes all of the presuppositions that we don't always have the time for and makes them into their own fields of study with people dedicated to answering questions in them. A lot of these philosophical conversations might seem useless, but they are not. They exist at the foundation of a lot of these disciplines that we see as important. You can be a lawyer, but if you're called up to defend someone, you cannot exactly say, well, Your Honor, I think you should let my client go, because the law is all made up anyways. It's just a thing that we all agree to. We do not have any metaphysical basis for justifying the existence of the law. That's not going to go very well. It is important to question what the law is, where the law comes from, where it derives its authority from. It would just be really strange to make that argument when you're arguing in front of a judge with somebody's livelihood in mind. But these questions still need to be asked. Now, in pursuing a PhD, you do something similar. You take a question, a concept, an idea, and you make that into its own body of study, and you go as deep into it as possible. Now, you might say that that's all good and fine, but clearly some of these questions are useless. If you devote your life to studying the mating pattern of a particular slug that only exists somewhere in the Amazon, who really cares? Now, the interesting thing here is that one of the beautiful things about academia, about scholarship in principle, is that there is an underlying belief at the center of the academic enterprise that says that it is good to try to know things. It is better to try to know things than to not. A world in which we have a PhD dissertation dedicated to the mating patterns of a particular slug that exists only in the Amazon is better than a world where that piece of knowledge does not exist. Now, why is it better? That is in part because as human beings, we don't always know what knowledge is going to be necessary. The only real way for academia to be true to some of these ideals is to have people who produce knowledge for its own sake and for no other reason. Because governments do not always know exactly what needs to be known, and so an academic climate where everything that is being researched is done so at the diktats of the government is not a true academic environment. We do not always know what our knowledge is going to lead to. We do not always know what the problems of the future are going to be. We do not always know what it is necessary to know. So the best way for academia to live up to these ideals is to allow people to produce knowledge for its own sake, to pursue whatever they find interesting. It might be that 100 years from now, our species will be almost getting extinct, and the only thing that will save us is understanding what those slugs did in the Amazon, because their mating patterns are super important to this whole thing. And 100 years from now, it would be really good that we have a PhD dissertation, that we had somebody who devoted their life to this. Now, even if that never happens, even if the fate of humanity never rests on us knowing about this mating pattern of these slugs, it is still better to know than not to. We don't always know what is necessary to know. A couple of years ago, people were telling everybody to go into coding, and these days some of my computer science friends are a bit nervous because AI seems to be destroying their job prospects. Now, there's an argument that can be made here that the modern world cannot accommodate these ideals of academia. It is not wise to go hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt to pursue some of these topics. That is an interesting point for some other time. For now, what do you think?